Dawn arrives without ceremony. A pale light stretches across a barren plain where wind moves slowly over fractured stone. Nothing about the landscape suggests urgency. Nothing suggests revision. And yet beneath this quiet earth, something once waited that would disturb a story thought to be settled. The ground had already been surveyed. Layers measured. Dates assigned. Maps drawn with careful confidence. The region was considered understood, catalogued, nearly closed. But when the bones emerged, brushed clean by patient hands, they did not align with expectation. They belonged to something undeniably human, yet not fully placed within the neat progression printed in textbooks. The skull was shaped in a way that resisted easy labeling. Its capacity seemed unfamiliar. The brow was both heavy and refined. The jaw hinted at strength, yet the cranial vault carried proportions that seemed almost modern. When the first measurements were taken, the numbers created silence. Not excitement. Silence because numbers anchor belief, and these numbers did not cooperate. The sediment surrounding the remains suggested an age that stretched further back than the established timeline permitted for certain features. If the dating held, then traits thought to have emerged later had appeared earlier. If the morphology was correct, then the branching of our ancestry was less orderly than assumed. At first, the discovery was approached with caution. Alternative explanations were considered. Could the layers have shifted? Could the dating be flawed? Science demands scrutiny. It moves deliberately, preferring correction over spectacle. Yet, as independent analyses confirmed the strangeness, the unease deepened. This was not the only case. Across different continents, other finds had surfaced over decades. A femur that appeared too modern for its geological context. A set of teeth whose wear patterns suggested an unexpected diet. A skull too small, yet dated too recently. Remains that seemed to belong both before and after their assigned era. Individually, each anomaly could be adjusted. A remeasurement here, a revised estimate there. A new classification inserted between known categories. The tree of human ancestry was flexible enough to add branches, but occasionally a fossil did more than add a branch. It questioned the shape of the trunk. In some cases, specimens were reclassified under broader group names. A distinctive trait became variation. An inconvenient date became uncertain, not erased, not hidden, but softened, folded carefully into language that reduced friction. Because coherence matters, the human origin story is taught as progression, early forms, gradual refinement, eventual emergence, clean lines, predictable transitions. But these bones suggested something less linear, something layered, overlapping, perhaps even braided. No accusation is necessary to feel the tension. The scientists who studied these remains were not villains guarding secrets. They were researchers balancing evidence against established frameworks, aware that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof. Yet there is a difference between disproven and difficult, and difficulty has a way of being postponed. What if the story of human origins was simplified? Not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. The wind continues across the plain. The exposed stone remains unmoved. But beneath the surface of certainty, a quiet fracture has formed. If a single set of bones can unsettle chronology, then the question shifts gently, but inevitably. Long before the bones unsettled a quiet plain, long before carbon dates and cranial measurements complicated certainty, the human timeline itself had to be built from fragments. Not in ancient caves, but in candlelit studies and early museums, where naturalists attempted something audacious to arrange the deep past in order. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Earth was becoming legible. Rock layers were examined like pages in a vast silent book. Lower strata suggested older worlds. Higher layers spoke of more recent ages. Geologists traced patterns in stone, learning that sediment settled slowly, that fossils embedded within it could mark epochs. Time, once measured in dynasties and scripture, began stretching into immensities. Fossils followed. Teeth, femurs, partial skulls emerged from quarries and riverbanks. Some resembled modern humans. Others did not. The question was not whether humanity had changed, but how to position each fragment in sequence. Order was necessary. Without order, there was only accumulation. So classification systems were formed. Species were named. Traits were catalogued. Gradations were proposed. Early hominins were placed lower on branching charts. later forms nearer to modern humans. Diagrams appeared in academic journals, then in classrooms. A tree with a trunk and ascending limbs began to take shape. It seemed elegant, but elegance can conceal revision. As decades passed, new discoveries reshaped the diagram. A skull from one continent suggested earlier migrations. A jawbone from another region blurred boundaries between species thought separate. Dates were refined as techniques improved. Radiometric dating replaced guesswork. Stratigraphy became more precise. Each advance adjusted the narrative. The tree was never fixed. It was redrawn quietly, again and again. Yet outside research circles, the impression of stability lingered. Textbooks condensed decades of debate into clear illustrations. The complexity of overlapping timelines was simplified into forward motion. This was not deception. Students need clarity before nuance. Stories are easier to absorb when they move in one direction. Methodical systems require structure. Structure demands coherence, but coherence is selective. When a discovery fit neatly into the existing framework, it strengthened the diagram. When it introduced too many branches, too many uncertain overlaps, it required refinement. New subcategories appeared. Transitional labels were inserted. Occasionally, definitions shifted to preserve continuity. Not because scientists rejected contradiction, but because models must remain usable. What happens to a discovery that doesn't fit the diagram? Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it is reinterpreted until it does fit, or until new data provides context. Science thrives on challenge, yet it also depends on shared understanding. If every anomaly shattered the entire structure, progress would stall. So tension is absorbed, chaos is organized. Over time, the public inherits a distilled version of this process, a timeline that appears more settled than it truly is. The impression of straight ascent, gradual refinement, orderly branching, but beneath that clarity lies revision. Beneath the diagram lies debate. The architecture of human evolution is not a monument carved once in stone. It is scaffolding constantly adjusted. That does not weaken it. It makes it alive. And now that the framework itself is visible, its beams, its revisions, its careful simplifications, the bones from the barren plain take on new weight. Because once you understand how the timeline was assembled, you begin to notice where its edges strain. The next step is inevitable. If the architecture is flexible, then which fossils push against it the hardest? The camera moves again, no longer fixed on one barren plain, but drifting across continents. A dig site in East Africa, where dust clings to careful hands. A limestone cave in Southeast Asia, where fragments rest in shadow. A cold valley in Europe, where bone emerges from clay that has not seen light in tens of thousands of years. Each discovery feels separate at first, isolated, local, but when placed beside one another, they begin to whisper the same unsettling suggestion. Humanity was not alone in its own story. Skulls appear with unfamiliar proportions. A brow ridge heavier than ours, yet paired with a cranial capacity that suggests intelligence. Teeth shaped differently, adapted to diets that hint at varied environments. A finger bone so small it nearly escaped attention, later revealing through genetic analysis an entire population once unknown. Some remains imply coexistence. Dates overlap. Tools found in nearby strata resemble one another, though attributed to distinct groups. The clean progression from primitive to advanced begins to blur at the edges. These were not simple replacements. They were neighbours. Across Africa, fossils suggest diversity far deeper than once imagined. Multiple human-like populations may have occupied the same regions, separated not by oceans, but by subtle boundaries of terrain and behaviour. In Asia, evidence points to migrations earlier than models had predicted. In Europe, skeletal remains hint at long periods of shared territory. The tree begins to resemble something else. Not a trunk with orderly branches, but a web, threads crossing and merging. A pattern of divergence and reconnection. Genetics intensifies this vision. As ancient DNA was extracted from bone fragments, once considered little more than curiosities, unexpected signals appeared in modern genomes. Traces. Small percentages of inherited material that could only have come from lineages thought entirely separate. This was not theory. It was measurable. Interbreeding had occurred. Populations once labelled distinct had met, mingled, shared descendants. The idea of a singular ascent, one group advancing while others faded in isolation, became difficult to defend. Instead, humanity's deep past looked crowded, interactive, layered. What if we are not the first us to walk the earth? The question lingers not as fantasy, but as implication. If several human-like beings possessed intelligence, crafted tools, buried their dead, perhaps even painted symbols, then the definition of ease expands. Modern humanity may not represent a clean break from what came before. It may represent continuation, blending survival within a broader network. And networks are fragile. Some lineages thrived for thousands of years before disappearing. Others endured across shifting climates, only to diminish as environments changed. Again, their extinction does not appear as violent conquest in most cases. It reads instead as gradual thinning, a reduction in numbers, a final generation whose stories faded without record. Modern humans, in this view, are not the triumphant endpoint of a linear climb. They are the remaining thread in a tapestry that once held many patterns. The realization is destabilizing, but also grounding. Evolution was experimental. Diverse forms tested different adaptations. Some were strong in certain climates, others resilient in others. Intelligence did not belong to one exclusive branch. Culture did not ignite in isolation. Beneath our inherited timelines lies a deeper complexity. Populations overlapping, separating, reconnecting, vanishing. Echoes of unknown branches still resonate quietly within our DNA, within our bones. And as the camera pulls back from these scattered excavation sites, a larger silence begins to form around the question that cannot be ignored. If many branches once existed, where did they all go? Why does only one remain? Long before cities, before monuments, before any written name echoed through valleys, there was a world of wind and ice. The camera moves slowly across an open plain under a pale ice age sky. Grasslands stretch farther than sight can measure. Glaciers loom in the distance, advancing and retreating like silent giants. The air is colder, thinner, sharper. This was the world early humans inherited. It was not stable. Climate shifted in cycles that no generation could fully predict. Winters deepened, then they softened. Rivers changed course. Forests expanded and collapsed. Vast herds of mammoth, bison, and wild horses moved with the seasons, and where they moved, predators followed. Among them walked several kinds of humans. They were not identical, but they were not strangers either. Different populations occupied overlapping territories across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Some were stockier, built for colder climates. Others were leaner, adapted for long-distance travel. They shaped stone with careful hands. They controlled fire. In certain regions, they placed their dead in shallow graves, suggesting ritual or memory. These were not crude beginnings. They were functioning communities, cooperative, observant, adaptive. Yet adaptation did not look the same everywhere. In open tundra, survival favored endurance and strength. In dense forests, strategy and mobility mattered more. Along coasts, knowledge of tides and marine life became essential. Intelligence expressed itself in different forms, depending on the terrain. For thousands of years, these groups endured fluctuating conditions. They tracked animal migrations. They adjusted tool designs. They developed clothing from hides and fibers. They read subtle signs in wind and sky. Life was precarious, but it was not chaotic. It followed rhythms. Even if those rhythms were unpredictable, then the environment shifted again. Glacial periods tightened their grip. Temperatures dropped. Habitats compressed. Grasslands transformed. Resources thinned. In some eras, volcanic eruptions darkened the sky, casting fine ash across continents. Sunlight weakened. Growing seasons shortened. Entire ecosystems staggered. Extinction followed. Not always dramatic. Not always sudden. Sometimes a population simply dwindled as conditions narrowed around them. A favoured hunting ground disappeared beneath ice. A migration corridor closed. A drought lingered too long. A volcanic winter interrupted reproduction just enough to tip numbers below recovery. Many lineages did not vanish because they lacked intelligence or cooperation. They vanished because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Geography mattered. Timing mattered. Accident mattered. Survival in this landscape was not proof of superiority. It was often proof of fortune. If survival is not proof of superiority, what truly separated the lineage that endured? Perhaps it was flexibility in diet. Perhaps wider social networks allowed distant groups to exchange resources. Perhaps mobility enabled escape from tightening climates. Or perhaps small differences compounded quietly over generations until one branch simply held on long enough. The plains offer no verdict. The glaciers cast no judgment. Nature does not crown winners. It applies pressure. And under that pressure, multiple human-like populations coexisted, at times unaware of each other, at times crossing paths. Their tools occasionally resembled one another. Their fires burned under the same cold stars. Their children grew in caves and open camps, learning stories and survival strategies unique to their people. Yet, as millennia passed, some of those voices faded. The wind over the ancient plain feels wider. Now, fewer footprints mark the snow, the environment explains. But not everything. Because if climate alone determined fate, we would expect a uniform thinning. Instead, patterns hint at something more layered. If environment alone does not explain disappearance, then attention must turn to a deeper question. What happened when these lineages met? Night settles over a cold valley, and firelight pushes back the dark, in small trembling circles. Figures move at the edge of that glow. Their silhouettes are familiar, yet not entirely the same. Shoulders broader, faces shaped differently in the flicker. Hands calloused from shaping tools in their own distinct tradition. They stand across from one another, cautious, curious human. For a long time, the dominant image of this meeting was simple. One group advanced. The other retreated. Replacement. A clean handover of the planet from one lineage to another. It felt efficient, understandable, almost cinematic. But the Earth keeps quieter records than cinema. Archaeological layers tell a more patient story. In certain regions of Europe and Western Asia, tool styles once attributed strictly to one population appear alongside those of another. Ornaments emerge in places where earlier communities had already experimented with symbolic objects. Fire pits overlap in timelines that resist separation. The boundaries blur. Then genetics entered the conversations. When fragments of ancient DNA were extracted from fossilized bone, an unexpected signal surfaced within modern human genomes. Small percentages, scattered but undeniable, matched sequences from populations long considered extinct. Neanderthals were not entirely erased, nor were other archaic groups discovered later through molecular traces alone. The evidence was subtle but decisive. They met, they intertwined. They left descendants. The myth of total replacement softened. Humanity did not simply conquer what came before. It mingled. It borrowed. It absorbed. The line between us and them thinned until it became difficult to define where one ended and the other began. What if the ghosts of forgotten ancestors are not buried, but living quietly inside us? This is not poetry. It is biology. Modern populations outside parts of Africa carry measurable fragments of Neanderthal inheritance. Certain immune responses, aspects of skin and hair adaptation, even traits related to altitude tolerance may trace back to these ancient encounters. Other archaic lineages, once known only through a single finger bone and a few molars, left their own subtle imprints. The meetings were not necessarily peaceful, nor were they necessarily violent. The record does not offer a script. It offers fragments. But contact in multiple places and across thousands of years is no longer speculation. And yet, despite blending, most distinct lineages faded as separate identities. Interbreeding did not preserve them as parallel civilizations. Instead, it diluted boundaries. Cultural patterns may have spread unevenly. Language complexity, expanded social networks, and long-distance exchange could have created cumulative advantages. Groups with wider alliances might have weathered resource shortages more effectively. Symbolic communication may have strengthened cohesion across larger territories. These differences need not be dramatic to be decisive. Subtle edges, repeated over generations, compound. No single battle decided the outcome. No singular event erased entire peoples. The process appears gradual, merging here, decline there, a reduction in isolated pockets. Children born of mixed ancestry growing into communities that identified more strongly with one cultural tradition than another. Over time, distinct labels dissolved. But disappearance does not mean absence. It means transformation. Within modern humanity, fragments persist. Signals pass through countless generations, surviving migrations, plagues, climatic swings. The ancient faces that once stood across unfamiliar fires are no longer separate. They are layered within us. If fragments of the past remain inside our cells, then extinction was not absolute. It was partial. It was blended. And that realization opens another question, quieter but no less profound. If some ancestors survive in us biologically, what knowledge vanished when their distinct worlds faded? When a population disappears, it is not only bodies that vanish. It is memory. Imagine a small community huddled beside a river at the edge of winter. They know which plants can be eaten raw and which must be soaked. They recognize the cry of a distant predator long before it approaches. They pass down stories about seasonal shifts, about safe routes through mountain passes, about rituals that bind them together when fear rises. None of this is written. It moves through voice, through repetition, through example, and it can end in a single generation. If illness spreads through a valley, if a hunting ground collapses, if a drought lingers too long, if the last elders die without transmitting their knowledge fully, oral traditions are living things, and living things are fragile. Now multiply that across thousands of years. Extinct lineages did not merely use territory. They carried unique ways of understanding the world. Their tools were shaped by particular landscapes. Their shelters reflected local materials. Some crafted ornaments that suggest symbolic thinking. Others selected pigments for reasons we can only guess. These were not mindless adaptations. They were cultural expressions. Yet most of it dissolved. Archaeological sites preserve stone and bone. Occasionally, a carved object survives. But tone of voice, myth, gesture, accumulated wisdom. These leave no imprint in sediment. When a lineage thinned beyond recovery, its intellectual inheritance thinned with it. The common narrative of human progress imagines steady ascent, simple tools to complex machinery, primitive language to written systems, isolated tribes to global networks. But the record whispers something more uneven. There were surges of ingenuity, followed by contraction. There were cultural experiments that did not lead to permanence. There were resets. Modern humanity may not represent the uninterrupted climb of intelligence. It may represent survivors of multiple narrowing corridors, biological bottlenecks and cultural collapses intertwined. Tools attributed to extinct groups show skill once underestimated. Symbolic artifacts hint at inner worlds we barely comprehend. The sophistication did not belong exclusively to those who endured. We inherit a fragment of a larger tapestry. How many human stories ended without leaving a single sentence behind? The question carries no accusation. It carries humility. We are accustomed to thinking of the past as preparation for us, as if earlier forms existed to lead here. But those lineages lived complete lives independent of our continuation. Their disappearance was not a footnote. It was final. And extinction is not always violent. It does not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it is quieter, a campfire not relit, a trail no longer travelled, a name unspoken until it fades entirely. The land remembers almost nothing. Under stars that look the same as ours, children once listened to stories we will never hear. Songs rose into cold air and disappeared without record. Techniques, refined over centuries, dissolved as populations thinned. Innovation did not always accumulate. Sometimes it scattered. What survives shapes our narrative. What vanished shapes our blind spots. The past, then, was likely more diverse, more experimental, and more delicate than textbooks suggest. Not a straight path towards civilization, but a field of attempts. Some flourishing briefly, others extinguished before recognition. As the firelight dims on those ancient camps, a deeper silence opens. If entire cultures could fade without trace in relatively recent millennia, what lies further back beyond even fossil memory? Were there chapters of humanity erased so completely that we cannot even imagine their outline? The deeper we descend into time, the quieter it becomes. The camera slips beneath familiar layers of sediment, below the strata that have yielded skulls and femurs and traces of long-dead fires. Beneath those layers lies older Earth, compacted, altered, folded under pressure, so immense that whatever it once held has been transformed beyond recognition. Here, there are no bones waiting to be brushed clean, only stone. Fossils, we are reminded, are accidents. For a skeleton to endure, conditions must align with improbable precision. A body must be buried quickly, shielded from scavengers and decay. Minerals must seep into pores, replacing organic matter slowly over thousands of years. The surrounding environment must remain stable enough not to crush or dissolve the forming relic. Most lives do not receive such treatment. Most lives return to soil without record. Imagine entire populations that walked across floodplains, sheltered under trees, hunted along coasts, and left nothing but faint impressions, soon erased by wind and water. A shift in climate could scatter them. Rising seas could swallow their camps. Acidic soil could dissolve bone entirely. In tropical regions especially, preservation is rare. Heat and moisture are relentless archivists of absence. The geological record contains gaps, long stretches where fossil evidence thins dramatically, not because nothing lived, but because nothing survived the passage intact. The Earth does not curate evenly. It preserves selectively, often without regard for significance. This absence creates a particular kind of tension. When we examine the known fossils, we tend to imagine a sequence anchored by tangible remains. But what if those remains represent only the narrowest fraction of what once existed? What if our evolutionary map resembles a constellation drawn from scattered stars, the spaces between far greater than the lights themselves? Silence can be misleading. It can feel like emptiness. In truth, it may conceal abundance. There are periods in deep prehistory where evidence becomes sparse, where the trail fades into stone that has been eroded, subducted, or metamorphosed beyond recovery. The further back we reach, the fewer physical traces remain. Time itself acts as an eraser. Yet another kind of clock continues ticking inside living cells. Genetic research sometimes suggests divergence events older than current fossil discoveries confirm. By measuring the rate at which mutations accumulate over generations, scientists estimate when lineages may have separated. Occasionally, these molecular clocks hint at splits that predate the oldest known skeletal remains. The signals are subtle, debated, refined, but they exist. This does not overturn the fossil record. It complicates it. If genetic divergence occurred earlier than physical evidence shows, then either fossils await discovery or preservation failed entirely. The possibility widens the horizon of uncertainty. It suggests that some early branches of human ancestry may lie beyond recovery, dissolved before stone could cradle them. What if our earliest ancestors lived and disappeared before the Earth ever had a chance to remember them? The question is not meant to dramatize. It rests quietly within geological reality. Preservation is fragile. Erosion is patient. Entire ecosystems have been recycled through tectonic motion, crushed beneath shifting plates and reformed as mountains. Human memory reaches only so far. Fossil memory reaches less. The camera lingers in the darkness beneath familiar strata. No bones gleam in this depth. No artifacts wait in recognizable form. Only compressed earth bearing the weight of lost time. If the archive of stone is incomplete, then the next layer of history must be sought elsewhere. Perhaps not in bones at all, but in the code carried quietly within us. If stone forgets, the body remembers. The camera leaves the quarry and the sediment behind and moves into the invisible, into cells, into strands so thin they cannot be seen without magnification. Within nearly every living human rests a record more durable than bone, though no less fragile in its own way. DNA coils quietly inside us, carrying instructions, yes, but also history. Across generations, tiny changes appear in this code, mutations. Most are harmless. Some are useful. A few disappear. These variations accumulate slowly, like subtle edits made to a manuscript over thousands of years. By comparing these edits between populations, scientists can estimate when groups separated, when they migrated, when they reconnected. It is not storytelling in the traditional sense. It is comparison. Pattern recognition, a careful tracing of shared sequences across continents. When researchers analyze genomes from distant populations, they sometimes find markers that appear unexpectedly similar. People separated by oceans carry fragments of ancient sequences that point backward to common ancestors. Some variations are so old that they predate known migrations. Others cluster in ways that suggest complex movement, not a single wave outward, but multiple journeys, some returning, some overlapping. DNA does not speak in words. It speaks in probabilities. Through molecular clocks, researchers estimate the timing of divergence events. If two populations share a certain pattern of mutations, it suggests a branch point in deep time. When these estimated dates are compared with fossil findings, they usually align within reasonable margins. But not always. Sometimes the genetic evidence hints at a split older than the earliest known skeletal remains. Sometimes it suggests contact between groups that fossil evidence has not yet confirmed in a given region. These discrepancies are discussed carefully in academic circles. They are tested, debated, recalibrated. Science does not leap to conclusions, but the signals persist. What they imply is subtle, yet profound. Evolution may not resemble a tidy branching tree where each split remains clean and separate. Instead, it may resemble a braided river. Channels dividing and merging, reconnecting over time. Populations diverge, adapt, then meet again. Gene flow resumes. Boundaries blur. This does not dismantle what we know. It enriches it. The image of a single ancestral population, giving rise neatly to another, becomes harder to sustain. Genetic data shows that lineages interwove more often than once assumed. Some ancient groups, identified only through DNA extracted from fragmentary remains, reveal entire chapters of ancestry, once invisible to fossil hunters. If bones can be lost, but DNA survives, what secrets are still written inside us? The question carries both wonder and caution. DNA preserves relationships, but it does not preserve culture, language, or the texture of daily life. It traces connection, not memory. It tells us that populations met, that ancestors mingled, that divergence and reunion shaped who we are. But even this archive has limits. DNA degrades over extreme time spans. Beyond certain thresholds, mutation rates blur into statistical uncertainty. Molecular clocks must be calibrated against fossil data. Each source depends on the other. When they disagree, it is not failure. It is invitation to refine, to look again. The realization that our ancestry may be more braided than linear, unsettled, simple narratives. It also invites humility. We are carriers of layered histories, some recorded in bone, others only in code. Yet even this coded memory cannot reach infinitely backward. There are forces in Earth's past powerful enough to thin populations to the edge of extinction. Events that compress diversity so drastically that entire lineages may have vanished almost completely. To understand those earliest chapters, we must turn from gradual mutation to sudden pressure, from accumulation to survival against near inertia. There are moments in deep time when the curve of humanity narrows almost to a thread. The camera pulls back from genetic code and returns to the planet itself. Ice sheets advance once more. Volcanoes breathe ash into darkened skies. Oceans shift. What appears gradual over millennia can become abrupt in geological terms. Climate records etched into ice cores and ocean sediments reveal periods of sudden change. Temperatures plunging, rainfall patterns collapsing, ecosystems reorganizing within centuries. In such moments, abundance contracts. Population bottlenecks occur when numbers fall so drastically that only a small fraction of a species survives. Genetic diversity shrinks with them. Later generations carry fewer variations because fewer ancestors remain to contribute their code. In modern human DNA, scientists detect signs of these constrictions, intervals where variation narrows more than steady population growth would predict. The implication is quiet, but staggering. At certain points in prehistory, humanity's ancestral population may have dwindled to surprisingly small numbers, not thousands scattered everywhere, but perhaps groups isolated by geography, surviving in ecological refuges while surrounding regions became uninhabitable. The exact figures are debated, refined, challenged, but the pattern of reduction is there. Imagine a world after such a contraction. Vast landscapes once occupied now empty. Migration routes silent. Fires extinguished across valleys that had echoed with human presence for generations. Only scattered communities remain, each carrying fragments of the ancestral story. Slivers of genetic diversity, pieces of cultural memory, survival strategies honed by necessity. Entire branches may have vanished during these intervals, not gradually absorbed, simply gone. We do not see their disappearance clearly in the fossil record. We see its shadow instead. Reduced variation, fewer surviving lineages. The absence speaks through scarcity. Some bottlenecks may have been driven by extreme climate events. Others by volcanic eruptions that cooled the planet and disrupted food chains. Disease could have played a role in dense clusters. The specific causes remain layered and complex. What matters is the compression itself. Survival, once again, was not guaranteed by intelligence alone. Catastrophe does not evaluate creativity. It tests endurance under constraint. A group living in a sheltered valley may have endured while another, equally capable, stood exposed to shifting winds and failing resources. Modern humanity may descend from a narrow genetic corridor, not because earlier ancestors were lesser, but because chance favored particular pockets of resilience. A coastline spared from extreme drought. A region buffered from glacial advance. Timing that allowed recovery rather than collapse. How close did humanity come to ending before it truly began? The question resonates without drama. It rests in probability. Evolutionary history is not a steady expansion. It is punctuated by contraction. Growth interrupted by thinning. Diversity reduced, then slowly rebuilt. Each bottleneck resets the canvas. With fewer survivors, certain traits become more prominent simply because alternatives disappeared. Culture, too, must adapt to reduced numbers. Knowledge networks shrink, traditions simplify. Cooperation becomes essential for mere continuity. Humanity's story may have been restarted more than once, not through advanced civilizations erased by mythic catastrophe, but through biological survival after environmental upheaval. Each restart carried forward only what endured in those remaining groups. The rest faded beyond retrieval. As the atmosphere softens and the image steadies, a realization settles quietly. The minds that would one day imagine cities and record history emerged, not from uninterrupted progress, but from repeated trials against extinction. If humanity survives such bottlenecks, the next question rises naturally from the silence they left behind. Shh! The ice recedes from the frame, and the world grows dimmer, warmer. We enter a cave lit by firelight. The flames tremble against stone walls, casting shadows that move like living things. In the glow, lines appear, simple at first, then deliberate. A curve becomes the outline of an animal. A handprint stains the rock, pigment pressed against the surface, as if someone reached through time to touch us. Something has shifted. This is not merely survival. This is expression. For generations, early humans had shaped tools, mastered fire, tracked prey across immense distances. But here, in the quiet of a sheltered chamber, a different kind of adaptation unfolds. Symbols emerge, not for immediate survival, but for meaning. The transformation was not sudden. There was no single moment when the mind awakened in full brilliance. Instead, small sparks accumulated. Language grew more complex, allowing ideas to stretch beyond immediate needs. Stories could carry lessons across seasons. Myths could bind individuals into shared identity. Burial practices began to reflect belief in continuity beyond death, or at least recognition of significance beyond utility. Beads fashioned from bone or shell travelled far from their sources, suggesting trade networks spanning vast distances. Red ochre was collected and applied deliberately. Patterns appeared again and again. These were signals of abstraction, the ability to imagine what is not physically present. For a long time, this flowering of imagination was attributed almost exclusively to our direct ancestors. The narrative placed symbolic thought firmly within a single lineage, marking it as the defining difference between Homo sapiens and all who came before. But the stone walls have complicated that certainty. Archaeological discoveries hint that symbolic behavior may have existed earlier than once believed. Engravings, predating traditional timelines, appear in caves associated with other human species. Ornaments have been found in contexts that suggest they were crafted not by early modern humans, but by cousins whose faces were shaped differently. If this evidence holds, then imagination did not ignite in isolation. It flickered in multiple lineages. Creative expression was not the invention of one branch, but perhaps a shared inheritance, stretching deeper into our ancestry. What if creativity was not invented, but inherited from ancestors we barely remember? The thought reshapes the cave itself. The handprints on the wall are no longer symbols of singular genius, but echoes of a broader awakening. Multiple populations may have looked at the same night sky and woven narratives around distant stars. Multiple groups may have gathered around separate fires, telling stories that gave shape to fear and hope. Imagination becomes less a dividing line and more a common thread. This does not erase difference. Variations in language complexity, social organization, and cultural transmission still mattered. Over time, certain groups may have woven tighter networks of shared meaning, allowing myths and knowledge to travel further. But the spark itself may have been widespread. The cave grows quiet again. The painted animals do not move. Yet they carry evidence of a mind capable of stepping beyond the present moment. A mind that could visualize what was not directly in front of it. And once that threshold was crossed, survival itself began to change. If imagination predates civilization, then the question becomes not whether early humans could create meaning, but how that capacity reshaped the way they endured. The firelight expands beyond the cave and into open air. Figures gather not only in small family clusters, but in larger circles. What was once a band of 20 becomes a web of many bands, linked by language, ritual, and recognition. Voices carry further. Stories travel. Something subtle shifts in the architecture of survival. Early human communities were already cooperative. Hunting large animals required coordination. Protecting children demanded shared vigilance. But at a certain point, cooperation stretched beyond immediate kin. Individuals began to trust those they were not directly related to. Symbols and shared myths acted like invisible bridges, connecting strangers into allies. Language played its quiet role. With more complex communication, humans could describe events not present, plan beyond the next day, warn of dangers unseen. Information could move across distance without requiring direct experience. One group could learn from another's failure without enduring it themselves. Anthropological studies of both ancient remains and modern hunter-gatherer societies suggest that flexibility in alliance building may have been decisive. When climate tightened its grip, communities with wider networks had options. If one region suffered drought, ties to distant groups offered refuge. Exchange of goods meant exchange of genetic diversity. Exchange of stories meant shared knowledge. Physical strength still mattered. Intelligence still mattered. But something else began to carry equal weight. Belief. Shared myths created cohesion among individuals who might otherwise remain cautious. Rituals reinforced identity. Symbols marked belonging. These were not decorative additions to survival. They were structural reinforcements. Culture became glue. Was humanity's greatest evolutionary leap not physical, but social? The idea reframes dominance in quiet terms. Survival did not necessarily favor the tallest, the strongest, or even the individually clever. It favored those capable of large-scale trust. Groups able to cooperate across extended networks could pool resources, share innovations, and stabilize against environmental shock. Fragmented populations, however capable, may have struggled when conditions tightened. Without broad alliances, recovery after disaster became more difficult. Without shared narratives, loyalty remained narrow. Cohesion multiplied strength. This did not happen overnight. Social complexity deepened gradually. Seasonal gatherings allowed distant bands to reconnect, exchange mates, trade materials, and renew shared identity. Over generations, these gatherings strengthened bonds that extended beyond bloodline. The effect was cumulative. Cooperation allowed knowledge to circulate widely. A new tool design did not remain isolated. A successful hunting strategy could be adopted across regions. Cultural practices spread faster than genes. Networks became reservoirs of innovation. Dominance, then, may not have emerged from one lineage overpowering another through force alone. It may have grown from superior cohesion. In times of stress, those communities endured longer. Culture was no longer simply expression, it was infrastructure. As cooperation expanded, trust networks widened. With widening networks came greater exchange of information. Stories travelled farther, rituals gained consistency across distance, and with that expansion, something else grew alongside alliance: memory. Not only individual recall, but shared memory. Stories repeated until they outlived those who first told them. Knowledge preserved beyond immediate experience. In the next quiet turn of the narrative, memory itself will become the fragile line between continuity and disappearance. The fire burns lower now, and the circle grows quieter. Faces glow in amber light as one voice carries across the dark. There are no markings on stone in this moment, no symbols etched for strangers to read. Everything depends on breath, on tone, on repetition. Before writing, memory lived in the body. Stories were not decoration, they were instruction. They carried maps, hidden inside metaphor, warnings disguised as legend. A tale about a restless spirit might encode knowledge of a dangerous ravine. A song about wandering ancestors might preserve migration routes across generations. Memory was layered, disguised, and sacred. But it was fragile. One lost generation could sever a chain hundreds of years long. If elders died before teaching apprentices, if disease swept through a settlement, if a group scattered under pressure and never regrouped, whole libraries vanished in silence. No ash remained, no parchment, only absence. As cooperation expanded, so did the scale of storytelling. Seasonal gatherings allowed myths to spread across bands. Rituals synchronized communities who might otherwise drift apart. Shared cosmologies strengthened alliances beyond direct kinship. Memory became collective, yet collective memory was also vulnerable to collapse. If early bottlenecks narrowed genetic diversity, cultural bottlenecks narrowed knowledge diversity. When populations contracted sharply, they did not carry every story forward. Some myths were deemed essential. Others faded as priorities shifted toward immediate survival. Complex cosmologies might simplify under stress. Artistic traditions might thin. Over time, countless belief systems dissolved, not because they were disproven, but because the communities that held them no longer existed to sustain them. How many ancient stories vanished because no one remained to tell them? The question lingers over the embers. We tend to view human history as accumulation, each generation building upon the last. But the deeper past suggests something less stable. Growth interrupted by thinning, flourishing followed by forgetting, not a continuous archive, but a tapestry, periodically torn and rewoven. Memory is not neutral. It requires continuity of community. It requires safety long enough to preserve nuance. When pressure mounts, practicality dominates. Songs shorten. Rituals condense. Knowledge prioritizes survival first, meaning later. And yet, even under constraint, storytelling persisted. Around each fire, children listened. They asked questions. They absorbed patterns of speech and shared references. Language shaped thought. Thought shaped identity. Identity shaped action. Civilization has not yet entered this landscape. There are no walls, no written tablets, no carved monuments, but the foundation is set. Minds capable of abstraction, cooperation, and narrative now span territories. Ideas can travel further than individuals. Shared myths bind strangers into networks that outlast singular lives. The difference between biological survival and cultural survival begins to matter more. A lineage can persist genetically, yet lose its stories entirely. Another may fade biologically, while fragments of its culture are absorbed into neighbors. Continuity becomes layered, not simple. In the dark of the cave, voices soften and silence returns. The embers dim, but the capacity for memory remains. What began as survival strategy has become identity itself. With imagination awakened and cooperation expanded, storytelling becomes the vessel that carries humanity forward. And soon, something will change again. The wandering will slow. Temporary camps will give way to something more enduring. The next threshold waits quietly beyond the firelight. The moment when humanity stops merely passing through landscapes and begins reshaping them into permanence. The wind still moves across open grasslands, bending tall stems in quiet waves. For generations, people have followed that wind. They tracked herds, shifted camps, read the land like a moving map. Mobility was protection. When food grew scarce, they moved. When weather hardened, they relocated. The rhythm of life was migration. And then, slowly, something changed. A small group returns to a familiar riverbank, not once but again and again. The soil there feels dependable. The water recedes at predictable intervals. Wild grains grow thick along the edges. Seeds fall from gathered stalks, and unnoticed at first, new plants appear where they camped before. Someone recognizes a pattern. Someone decides to stay just a little longer. Repetition becomes rhythm. Seasons pass. Instead of dismantling shelters entirely, they reinforce them. Instead of following distant herds immediately, they plant near water. The shift is gradual, almost hesitant. No declaration marks the day wandering ends. There is no ceremony announcing settlement, only accumulation of return. What if the greatest transformation in human history began not with invention, but with the decision to stay? Agriculture is often described as a triumph, a leap forward that unlocked civilization. But from inside this moment, it does not feel triumphant. It feels uncertain. To plant seeds is to gamble with climate. To depend on crops is to tether survival to rainfall patterns and soil fertility. To build more permanent shelters is to expose oneself to being found, to being claimed. Nomadic life had risks, but it offered flexibility. Settled life offered stability at a cost. Early farming communities faced sudden shortages. When harvests failed, grain stores attracted pests and required protection. Dense living conditions encouraged disease to spread in ways scattered camps rarely allowed. Social tensions emerged when land and surplus became unevenly distributed. The threshold of settlement was not smooth. It demanded adjustment, resilience, negotiation, and not everyone crossed it. Archaeological evidence suggests that many groups continued mobile lifestyles long after farming was possible. Some preferred dietary diversity over reliance on cultivated grain. Hunting, fishing, and foraging provided nutrition and independence from seasonal uncertainty. For these communities, mobility remained strength. Agriculture was not instantly superior. It was one path among many. This complicates the comforting idea of inevitable progress. Civilization did not unfold like a script waiting to be performed. It emerged through fragile experiments. In some regions, early settlements flourished and endured. In others, they collapsed, abandoned as unsustainable under shifting conditions. Yet, in certain valleys and plains, persistence paid off. Gradually, knowledge of planting cycles deepened. Storage techniques improved. Irrigation developed in simple forms. Children grew up knowing one landscape intimately instead of passing through many. Familiarity bred attachment. The land began to feel less like a corridor and more like a home. With permanence came new possibilities. Surplus allowed specialization. Some individuals could focus less on food gathering and more on tool refinement, weaving, ritual. The social fabric thickened. But permanence also drew boundaries. As huts became houses and houses clustered into villages, questions of ownership quietly emerged. Who tended which field? Who guarded the grain? Who decided when planting began? Survival, once dictated primarily by migration skill, now required negotiation over space and labor. The decision to stay reshaped everything. The wind still crosses the grasslands, but now smoke rises from fixed points. The experiment continues, season after season. It could still fail. It has failed before. And as rooted life solidifies, a deeper transformation unfolds, less visible than planted fields, but equally powerful. If settling reshaped survival, how did it begin to reshape memory, identity, and power? The river still flows beside the settlement, but its presence feels different now. Where people once passed through lightly, they now return with expectation. Fields stretch outward in careful lines. Grain grows in predictable rows. The harvest is gathered and stored, and with storage comes a quiet shift in how people see one another. Grain cannot guard itself. Structures are built to contain it. Walls rise around granaries. Entrances are narrowed. Protection becomes organized, rather than spontaneous. In the act of protecting food, a new kind of awareness emerges, the awareness of possession. At first, ownership is practical. These tools belong to this family because they shaped them. This patch of earth is tended by these hands because they planted it. But over seasons, repetition strengthens association. What is tended becomes claimed. What is claimed becomes defended. Invisible concepts begin to solidify. Territory acquires meaning beyond geography. Boundaries, once fluid and seasonal, become marked and remembered. Paths that were once open now feel defined. A field has edges. A village has limits. The idea of ours grows more precise. With surplus comes organization. Grain must be distributed. Labor must be coordinated. Irrigation channels need maintenance. Leaders emerge not only as gifted storytellers or skilled hunters, but as coordinators, individuals capable of organizing collective effort. Their authority may begin as trust. Over time, it becomes structure. This transformation is gradual, but its direction is difficult to reverse. In small nomadic bands, resources were shared because accumulation was impractical. Mobility discouraged hoarding, but settlement allows storage, and storage allows surplus, and surplus changes dynamics. Some households gather more than others. Some individuals manage larger plots. The differences may begin as slight variations in skill or circumstance, yet they ripple outward. Archaeological sites reveal subtle signs of differentiation. Dwellings vary in size. Burial practices diverge. Some graves contain ornaments, tools, or offerings, while others are more sparse. Dietary analysis suggests uneven access to certain foods. None of this implies immediate oppression. It implies variation. Inequality may not have been born solely from conquest or deliberate dominance. It may have grown from the practicalities of storage. Surplus creates stability, but it also creates tension. Someone must decide how it is allocated. Someone must defend it in times of scarcity. When humans built walls to protect food, did they unknowingly build walls around one another? The question is not accusation. Civilization does not rise from harmony alone. It grows from negotiation between cooperation and control. Trust must be balanced with oversight, contribution measured, responsibility assigned. As settlements expand, social roles differentiate. Certain individuals become known for their ability to manage harvest cycles. Others excel in crafting tools or mediating disputes. Authority takes form through repetition of function. Hierarchy does not announce itself with a decree. It crystallizes through practice. Memory changes too. Land inheritance begins to matter. Stories shift from purely migratory origins to attachment narratives. The river becomes ancestral. The field becomes legacy. Children learn not only how to forage and hunt, but how to maintain what has been built. The hypnotic rhythm of settled life deepens. Seasons layer over one another. Boundaries harden slightly with each repetition. Cooperation remains essential, but it now operates within defined structures. As hierarchy stabilizes and surplus accumulates, a new possibility emerges, one that would have been unthinkable in purely mobile societies. With some freed from constant food gathering, time itself begins to bend. And where time bends, specialization ignites the next transformation. The camera lifts from clustered dwellings and moves towards something larger rising against the horizon. Stones arranged in deliberate circles. Earthen mounds shaped by countless hands. Pillars carved with symbols, no longer fully understood. These are not simple shelters. They are declarations. In a world where most of human history unfolded in motion, to raise a structure meant to outlast a single lifetime required a new kind of imagination. It demanded belief that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to justify effort measured in years. It required trust that descendants would care for what had been built. Permanent architecture signals continuity. Stone circles placed under open skies may have marked seasons or gatherings. Raised mounds could have served as ceremonial centers, anchoring memory in landscape. Communal temples suggest cooperation on a scale beyond immediate survival. These constructions were not efficient in the way a hunting strategy is efficient. They consumed labor without directly producing food. Yet they were built. Why? Perhaps because settled life sharpened awareness of time. When people returned to the same riverbank year after year, the past accumulated physically. Foundations layered over foundations. Stories attached to places. Building in stone transformed narrative into matter. A wall is harder to forget than a spoken legend. Did humanity learn to build cities, Or did building together teach humanity who it could become? The act of organizing labor towards something enduring reshaped identity. Gathering stones, shaping pillars, coordinating effort across seasons required planning and shared vision. It created roles beyond daily subsistence. Leaders guided construction. Specialists carved or aligned structures according to shared symbolism. Yet here, assumptions begin to wobble. Some monumental structures appear to predate widespread agriculture in their regions. Organized labor, ritual space, and coordinated construction may have emerged before full-scale farming dominance. This reverses the familiar sequence where agriculture leads inevitably to temples, then to cities. Instead, complexity may have surfaced in different forms at different times. In certain places, ritual centers may have drawn scattered groups together regularly, strengthening networks that later supported settlement. In others, early villages experimented with permanence, and abandoned it when conditions shifted. Civilization was not born in a single cradle, rising uniformly outward. It flickered. In one valley, communal architecture flourished briefly before fading. In another, small structures gradually expanded into lasting settlements. Some experiments ended quietly, leaving behind stones as their only testimony. The mosaic becomes clear. Human history does not move like a steady staircase. It resembles patches of light across a landscape at dusk, appearing, dimming, reappearing elsewhere. Monumental construction signals aspiration, but not necessarily continuity. Some of these early architects built for futures that never arrived. Still, the psychological shift endured. Once humans learned to shape landscape deliberately for symbolic purposes, the idea of permanence gained force. Structures became centers of gathering. Gathering became identity. Identity became lineage. The seeds of urban life lay not only in fields of grain, but in circles of stone. As the camera lingers on worn carvings exposed to centuries of weather, one realization settles gently. Power is beginning to take architectural form. Ritual space reinforces authority. Centralization begins to harden. If early settlements shape the architecture of power and permanence, another question waits beyond these stones. How many early civilizations rose and vanished before recorded history began? The camera drifts over a desert where dunes move like slow waves. Beneath that sand lie fragments of walls, broken tools, faint outlines of rooms long collapsed. The wind has been patient here. It buries, uncovers, buries again. What appears empty was once inhabited. Then the scene shifts. The shoreline stretches outward under pale light. But the water's edge is deceptive. Thousands of years ago, this coastline stood miles farther away. Vast plains that are now submerged once held rivers, forests, and open ground, where early communities likely gathered. At the end of the last ice age, the world changed not through a single cataclysm, but through gradual transformation. Glaciers melted. Sea levels rose more than 100 meters over millennia. Coastlines retreated inland. Low-lying lands disappeared beneath expanding oceans. These lost plains were not marginal territories. They were fertile corridors, rich in marine life and freshwater access. Such environments would have drawn early settlements naturally. Fish, shellfish, migratory routes, mild climates, conditions ideal for habitation. Yet much of that record now lies underwater. Archaeology is shaped by what is accessible. Excavation is possible where earth remains exposed. Mountains preserve caves. Arid deserts protect mud brick and stone. But coastal settlements, especially those built close to water for survival and trade, faced vulnerability. As sea levels rose, villages were submerged, and with them, traces of daily life. How much of humanity's earliest architecture now rests beneath oceans we rarely explore? The question is not romantic fantasy. Marine archaeology confirms that submerged landscapes exist across continental shelves. Ancient riverbeds can be traced beneath shallow seas. Stone tools and occasional structural remnants have been discovered offshore, hinting at former habitations. But exploration beneath water is costly and technically challenging. Vast areas remain unexamined. Absence of evidence in these drowned zones does not necessarily indicate absence of complexity. It may reflect environmental loss rather than historical emptiness. If early populations concentrated along coasts, as many later civilizations did, then rising seas may have erased entire chapters of development. Deserts offer a different silence. Shifting sands can protect ruins for centuries, yet they also obscure them. A settlement may lie meters below the surface, unknown until wind or excavation reveals it. Some cities have been rediscovered by accident, exposed when storms reshape dunes. Others remain hidden, hinted at only by subtle irregularities in terrain. What survives shapes narrative. Inland monumental sites dominate history books because they endure above ground. Coastal villages that predated them may have vanished without trace. If early experimentation with architecture and social organization occurred near water, much of it could now rest beneath layers of sediment and salt. This does not prove lost empires. It suggests incompleteness. The silence beneath sand and sea holds possibility. Not of mythic civilizations, but of ordinary communities whose complexity we cannot fully reconstruct. Their absence creates gaps in our models of development. The camera lingers over a calm ocean surface. Beneath it may lie foundations worn smooth by currents, pottery scattered across drowned valleys, hearths buried in silt. If water has hidden early settlements, then time has hidden their stories. And beyond the submerged plains, another layer of disappearance awaits. Civilizations that emerged into written records' shadow, only to vanish again. Not all cities leave echoes. Beyond the monumental capitals etched into textbooks, there were other settlements, planned, vibrant, interconnected, that flourished and declined before later empires fixed their names in stone. Excavations across different regions reveal streets laid out with intention, drainage systems engineered with precision, and trade goods imported from distant lands. Beads, ceramics, metalwork, and carefully aligned dwellings speak of coordination and culture. Yet many of these urban centers left few written traces. Some developed complex layouts without producing inscriptions that endured. Others may have recorded their histories on materials that decayed, wooden tablets, woven fibers, pigments on perishable surfaces. Without durable script carved into stone or baked into clay, their voices fell quiet. History, as it survives today, privileges literacy but resists erosion. Civilizations that carved laws into monuments or pressed cuneiform into tablets are easier to reconstruct. Their rulers and myths are named, their timelines feel continuous, but societies that communicated through oral tradition or ephemeral media often appear less significant, simply because fewer words remain. How many cities rose to brilliance only to vanish so completely that even their names dissolved? The question shifts perspective. Archaeological layers reveal urban experimentation in places not always remembered as central. Fortified settlements with evidence of centralized planning. Marketplaces linked through extensive trade routes. Artistic motifs suggesting shared cosmologies. These were not primitive preludes to later empires. They were expressions of organization and creativity in their own right, and they faded. Environmental stress may have weakened them. Trade networks might have shifted. Internal strain could have fragmented authority. In some cases, settlements were abandoned gradually rather than violently. A thinning population, a reduction in maintenance, and eventually silence. Without preserved narratives, later cultures often built over these sites, or forgot them entirely. When rediscovered centuries later, fragments appear without context, like pieces of a puzzle missing its image. The absence of written continuity can create the illusion of interruption where there may have been reinvention. Techniques in metallurgy, architecture, and governance may have emerged, disappeared, and reappeared independently across different eras. Cultural memory, unlike genetic memory, is not guaranteed transmission. It requires preservation. Civilizational memory may be cyclical rather than strictly cumulative. Advances are not always passed down intact. Sometimes narrows under pressure, only to expand again under favorable conditions. Urban planning principles can be forgotten and rediscovered. Trade networks can collapse and reconfigure elsewhere. The rise of later empires often overshadows those who preceded them, not necessarily because earlier societies were less capable, but because their records did not endure. What remains influences what we believe to be foundational. The camera drifts over ruins partially reclaimed by Earth, walls reduced to low ridges. streets suggested by subtle patterns in soil. The brilliance once contained here is inferred, not narrated. These places remind us that complexity does not guarantee remembrance. If cities themselves can disappear from record, the mystery deepens. Urban life is one form of continuity, but it is not invulnerable. Beneath the shifting layers of sand and story lies a more unsettling possibility. Were there turning points where humanity nearly lost more than cities, nearly lost continuity itself? The ruins do not speak of endings with thunder. They speak of thinning. Streets grow quiet, workshops close. Ritual spaces fall into disuse. A generation passes without repair, and what once felt permanent begins to loosen throughout human history. Complexity has risen and narrowed repeatedly. Plagues have swept through dense populations, reducing them in months. Invasions have shattered trade routes that took centuries to weave. Climate shifts have altered rainfall patterns, turning fertile valleys into dust. Internal strain has fragmented unity from within. Yet collapse is rarely absolute. It is contraction. When cities thin, villages endure. When trade networks fracture, local exchange persists. When monumental construction halts, basic skills remain alive in smaller forms. Knowledge compresses into what can be carried forward. Techniques survive in fragments. Myths adapt, shedding detail while preserving core meanings. And then, in time, expansion returns. New leaders reorganize. Trade pathways reopen, sometimes along altered routes. Technologies once forgotten are rediscovered independently or preserved quietly by peripheral communities. Writing systems shift. Belief systems merge. Renewal does not recreate what was lost exactly. It builds something shaped by absence. What if progress is not a ladder, but a tide that rises, retreats, and returns in new forms? The metaphor softens the sharp edges of apocalypse. A tide does not fail when it recedes. It is part of rhythm. But with each retreat, certain structures are carried away, while others remain anchored. Human history may follow such patterns, not a smooth ascent from ignorance to enlightenment, nor a hidden chain of advanced super-civilizations, erased by dramatic catastrophe. Instead, a delicate oscillation. Growth stretches outward. Strain compresses inward. Memory narrows. Memory expands. Technologies illustrate this rhythm. Metalworking techniques have appeared in different regions at different times, not always spreading directly from a single source. Architectural forms echo across centuries, but with variations shaped by local circumstance. Agricultural strategies evolve, disappear under stress, then re-emerge when conditions stabilize. Myths, too, carry signs of reset. Flood narratives appear across cultures separated by distance and time. Origin stories shift language while preserving themes. Cultural memory is not static. It reshapes itself to survive contraction. The forgotten human ancestors in this view were not only biological lineages reduced by climate or chance. They were cultural frameworks that dissolved during narrowing corridors of survival. Entire philosophies, ways of organizing community, interpretations of the sky and the self gone, not through suppression, but through attrition. We are descendants, not only of those who endured physically, but of what endured mentally. Countless perspectives vanished in cycles of contraction. What remained shaped the next expansion. The tide metaphor carries quiet gravity. It suggests resilience, but also loss. Not every idea returns. Not every skill is rediscovered. Some chapters close permanently. This reframing changes the lens through which we see the past. Rather than seeking singular peaks or secret empires hidden between lines, we begin to notice patterns. Contraction, preservation, transmission, renewal. In that pattern, humility replaces triumph. The camera lingers on a landscape, once dense with walls, now open to sky. Grass grows through stone. The silence is not empty, it is layered. With cycles of reinvention now visible, a new frontier emerges. Modern discoveries are beginning to reshape the architecture of our understanding, unsettling assumptions that once seemed firm. The next chapter turns toward that frontier, where new evidence invites us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about our ancient origins. The scene shifts from windswept plains to controlled light. Fluorescent bulbs hum above laboratory benches. Fossil fragments rest beneath glass, magnified on screens. measured by tools that did not exist a generation ago. Outside, excavation teams kneel in patient silence, brushing away layers of earth that have held their secrets for tens of thousands of years. In recent decades, discoveries have accelerated. Skulls uncovered in regions once thought peripheral to early human development suggest deeper complexity. A jawbone found in an unexpected layer extends migration timelines. Tiny bone fragments, analyzed through advanced genetic sequencing, reveal entire populations that left almost no visible trace in the fossil record. These findings do not erupt with certainty. They emerge slowly, scrutinized and re-scrutinized. Dating methods are cross-checked, measurements compared. Peer review stretches across years. Science does not move with haste when foundational models are involved. It moves carefully. And yet, caution does not prevent revision. Certain fossils that once appeared minor have later demanded reconsideration. A partial cranium catalogued quietly decades ago, re-examined with modern techniques, reveals traits that blur boundaries between established species. A site once thought local proves connected to broader migration patterns. Regions long considered marginal suddenly appear central in new models of human expansion. What if some of the most important discoveries about our ancestors were hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be understood? The question is not accusation. It is recognition of timing. Knowledge depends not only on discovery, but on availing frameworks. A fragment unearthed before advanced dating methods existed may sit unremarked until technology catches up. A pattern dismissed as anomaly may later align with broader evidence. Human origins, it becomes clear, are not a closed case. They are a living investigation. New classifications have emerged in recent years, expanding the roster of known hominin diversity. Migration timelines have stretched backward as early traces of modern humans appear farther from assumed origin points. Cognitive capabilities once attributed exclusively to certain populations are reconsidered in light of newly discovered artifacts. Species once believed isolated are now seen as participants in wider networks of interaction. The evolutionary tree is revised again, branches redrawn, connections re-established. What was peripheral becomes central. What seemed isolated becomes integrated. This process unsettles those who prefer definitive answers. But it also reveals something reassuring. The story refines itself. There is no singular authority guarding an unchanging narrative. Instead, there is accumulation, adjustment, dialogue between past interpretation and present evidence. Sometimes revisions occur quietly. Textbook diagrams shift subtly over years. Academic debates ripple beneath the surface before emerging in broader awareness. The sense that human ancestry was once mapped in final form begins to dissolve. Models are provisional. Interpretations adapt. The laboratory remains calm. No dramatic declarations accompany these changes, yet beneath the steady hum of equipment, something profound is happening. The past is being rewritten, not through conspiracy, but through refinement. Each new discovery acts as both answer and question. It clarifies one detail while unsettling another. It reminds us that the narrative of human origins is not settled. It is continuously reinterpreted. If modern discoveries keep reshaping the timeline, then another question presses quietly forward. How many assumptions still shape what we think we know? For generations, one image has quietly shaped how we imagine our beginnings. A line of figures stretching from left to right. The first stooped and indistinct. Each successive form straighter, taller, more refined. At the end stands the modern human, confident and upright. It is simple, memorable, reassuring, but simplicity can conceal complexity. The reality emerging from fossil sites and genetic analysis tells a far less orderly story. Evolution did not proceed in single file. It unfolded in branching clusters, overlapping timelines, and regional variations that coexisted rather than replaced one another neatly. Populations diverged and converged. They separated for thousands of years and then met again. Some migrated outward from Africa, earlier than once believed, establishing footholds that endured briefly before vanishing. Others followed later paths. Evidence suggests that certain groups returned, bringing with them new combinations of traits and traditions. Migration was not a single departure. It was a rhythm. The image of one continuous march dissolves into something more intricate. Human history begins to resemble a web of exchanges. Roots crossed, populations intermingled. Technologies and genes flowed in multiple directions. The idea of a singular defining exodus becomes difficult to sustain. If there was never a straight path from then to now, how many crossroads did we forget? The question lingers gently. It does not accuse. It invites reconsideration. Genetic evidence reveals layers of ancestry that reflect multiple movements across continents. Modern populations carry signals from different migration waves, some separated by tens of thousands of years. In some regions, local groups interacted with earlier settlers. In others, isolation created distinct variations before reconnecting later through exchange. Even within Africa, the story is not uniform. Diverse populations adapted to different environments, developing unique characteristics over long periods. The continent itself holds a complexity that challenges any notion of singular origin in one fixed location. The straight line was easier to teach. It implied progress in one direction, refinement over time. But evolution does not seek improvement. It seeks persistence. Variation thrives where conditions allow. As this realization settles, identity itself begins to feel more layered. Modern humanity may descend not from one defining journey, but from many intersecting paths. Our ancestry is not a solitary thread, pulled through time. It is woven from multiple strands. The metaphor of the march of progress fades into something more humbling. Instead of one lineage stepping forward while others fall behind, we see a landscape crowded with contemporaries. Some vanished, some merged, some endured. The outcome was not predetermined. This quieter understanding does not diminish humanity. It deepens it. It reminds us that our existence rests on convergence as much as divergence. Shared ancestry connects distant populations not through a single story, but through overlapping histories. The hypnotic rhythm of the narrative slows. The familiar diagram loosens its hold. The past becomes less tidy and more alive. The path from then to now is no longer straight, but branching, looping, intersecting. And once linear thinking dissolves, attention turns inward, because evidence alone does not shape understanding. It is filtered through interpretation, through cultural lenses, through the frameworks we bring to what we discover. With the straight line set aside, the next question is no longer about migration routes alone. It is about who constructs the map. The laboratory grows quiet again. Fossils rest beneath soft light. Charts are adjusted. Papers are written. But behind every diagram of human ancestry stands a human mind deciding how to arrange it. Scientists are not villains guarding secrets, nor are they omniscient narrators peering into eternity. They are researchers working within institutions, bound by funding cycles, academic traditions, and the slow rhythm of peer review. Their interpretations are shaped not only by evidence, but by context. Perspective matters. Certain regions have historically received more excavation funding than others. Political stability determines where long-term fieldwork can safely occur. As a result, some landscapes are studied intensively for decades, producing layered datasets and detailed timelines. Other regions remain comparatively quiet, not necessarily because they are empty of history, but because excavation there is difficult or delayed. Over time, patterns of attention create patterns of prominence. Sites that yield rich material early on become central in models of human evolution. Their narratives are refined repeatedly. Meanwhile, areas with fewer excavations generate fewer headlines, fewer diagrams, fewer reference points. What is studied intensively becomes foundational. What is studied less becomes peripheral. Is the story of human origins shaped only by fossils, or also by the eyes that choose where to look? The question unfolds without accusation. It invites awareness. Interpretation itself evolves. When new technologies emerge, improved dating techniques, advanced DNA sequencing, they often validate ideas that previously lacked strong support. Sometimes, a region dismissed as marginal gains renewed attention once methods improve. What once seemed anomalous may become central under a new lens. Narratives gain traction when they resonate with existing frameworks. A discovery that fits comfortably within accepted models is easier to integrate. One that demands substantial revision may face longer scrutiny. This is not resistance rooted in denial. It is caution rooted in complexity. Academic traditions also shape emphasis. Researchers are trained within intellectual lineages. The questions they ask often reflect the priorities of their mentors and institutions. Some frameworks become dominant, not through coercion, but through repetition and reinforcement. The subtle reveal settles gently into view. The map of our past is shaped not only by what we find, but by where we search and how we interpret. Attention directs resources. Resources direct discovery. Discovery reshapes attention. There is no hidden archive deliberately withheld. There are only limitations, political borders, environmental obstacles, finite funding. Human perspective. This realization introduces humility rather than doubt. The story of human ancestry remains incomplete, not because truth is suppressed, but because reconstruction requires access. Some landscapes lie beneath ocean. Some sit in remote terrains rarely excavated. Others are entangled in modern conflict. The narrative continues to refine itself within these constraints. Each generation of researchers inherits both knowledge and blind spots. As the camera pulls back from the lab, the fossil record appears less like a finished mosaic and more like a partially assembled puzzle. Gaps remain visible, edges uncertain. With interpretation itself examined, attention turns beyond what can be reconstructed easily. What parts of human ancestry remain entirely beyond recovery? What lies so deep in time, or so thoroughly erased, that even science may never retrieve it? The deeper the narrative reaches into the past, the quieter it becomes. Laboratories fade. Excavation sites dissolve into abstraction. We are left with time itself, vast and indifferent. Science is powerful, but it is not infinite. DNA, so patient in preserving whispers of ancestry, does not endure forever. Over immense spans, molecular bonds break down. Heat, moisture, radiation, all conspire against preservation. Beyond certain thresholds, genetic material fragments beyond reconstruction. Even under ideal conditions, retrieval has limits. There are lineages whose codes have already dissolved into biochemical noise. Fossils share a similar fragility. Bone must meet precise circumstances to survive mineralization. Most bodies return to Earth without a trace. Mountains rise and erode. Tectonic plates subduct ancient sediments deep into the mantle. Entire geological archives are recycled, compressed, transformed beyond recognition. Ecosystems vanish without memorial. There are epochs of prehistory where sedimentary layers thin or are absent entirely. Erosion removes context. Regions once lush become desert. Coastlines swallow evidence beneath saltwater and silt. Even with modern imaging techniques and deep drilling, some chapters of Earth's story have been lost to irretrievable change. Paleoanthropology works within these constraints. It pieces together fragments from scattered remains, calibrates molecular clocks against surviving fossils, reconstructs environments from isotopic signatures preserved in ancient shells. Each method refines understanding. Yet beyond certain depths in time, certainty fades. Speculation replaces precision. The further back we search, the more the record resembles scattered pages rather than a continuous manuscript. A jawbone here, a tooth there, a hint of tool, making etched into stone without context of the hands that shaped it. How far back can memory stretch before it dissolves into silence? The question does not accuse science of failure. It acknowledges entropy. Information disperses. Matter transforms. Even stars exhaust their fuel. The mystery of earliest ancestry is not hidden deliberately. It is thinned by time. Humanity's first branches may predate any recoverable fossil. Early experiments in bipedalism, cognition, or social behavior may have occurred in environments where preservation was impossible. These lineages might have existed fully, adapted, reproduced, and disappeared without leaving a single bone intact for future discovery. This realization shifts the tone from pursuit to humility. There are boundaries we cannot cross. Beyond them lies not secret knowledge waiting to be unlocked, but absence. Not conspiracy, but erosion. And yet, absence does not imply insignificance. Those unreachable ancestors shape the lineages that followed. Their genetic contributions, if any survived through bottlenecks, became embedded in those who endured. Their adaptive strategies influenced patterns of survival in ways we may never fully reconstruct. The camera lingers in open landscape, vast and quiet. The horizon feels expansive, yet bounded. If some ancestors are forever unreachable, not hidden but erased, then a subtler question emerges from the silence. What invisible influences from them still shape us today? The silence of deep time does not mean absence of influence. Even if bones have vanished and landscapes shifted, the past has not entirely loosened its hold. It lives in patterns of reaction, in quiet reflexes, in instincts that rise before conscious thought catches up. A sudden sound in the dark still tightens the body. An unfamiliar face in a crowded room draws attention faster than logic would justify. Cooperation within trusted circles feels easier than with distant strangers. These tendencies are not flaws. They are echoes. For hundreds of thousands of years, survival depended on reading subtle signals. A rustle in tall grass might mean predator or prey. The ability to recognize threat quickly favored those who lived long enough to pass on their genes. Group cohesion mattered deeply. Trust within small bands ensured shared defense and resource distribution. Suspicion toward outsiders could protect fragile communities under stress. These ancient pressures shaped neural architecture slowly, layer by layer. Are the decisions we make today guided partly by instincts forged thousands of generations ago? The question does not suggest that humanity is trapped by biology. Culture overlays instinct with reflection, ethics, and abstract reasoning. Yet underlying responses still inform perception. Fear can arise before analysis. Loyalty can precede logic. Evolutionary influences are scaffolding, not destiny. Even lineages that vanished as distinct populations may have left traces through interbreeding and shared ancestry. Genetic contributions carried forward across bottlenecks continue to shape immune responses, sensory sensitivities, even cognitive tendencies. Forgotten branches of humanity are not entirely absent. They persist as layers within us. The realization softens distance. Ancient ancestors are not distant characters inhabiting museum halls. They are woven into posture, reaction, preference. The capacity for empathy, for storytelling, for pattern recognition, all were refined under environmental pressures long before cities or scripts existed. Yet these traits are not static relics. They interact with modern contexts. Tribal instincts, once protective in small groups, now operate in societies of millions. Social cohesion, essential for survival in harsh climates, scales into national identities and cultural affiliations. The same wiring that supported cooperation can, under different conditions, foster division. Understanding this does not condemn humanity. It clarifies complexity. Bottlenecks and migrations did more than narrow genetic diversity. They sculpted behavioral patterns. Groups that endured environmental collapse may have favored adaptability over rigidity, communication over isolation. Those patterns, repeated over millennia, influence the psychological toolkit modern humans inherit. All strengths and vulnerabilities are ancient in origin. So too are our tendencies toward innovation, curiosity, and belief. The imagination first traced on cave walls still drives exploration. The social cohesion once necessary for hunting mammoths now sustains global collaboration. The past is layered within perception. As the narrative lingers in this reflective space, continuity becomes personal. The journey from ancient plains to present cities is not abstract. It runs through every mind, listening now. Forgotten human ancestors were not merely biological precursors. They were architects of tendencies. Their adaptations echo in stress responses, in bonding patterns, in the stories we still tell to explain ourselves. With this awareness, the lens shifts gently forward. If ancestral influence shapes who we are, then we must ask a quieter, more unsettling question. What kind of ancestors are we becoming? The perspective shifts almost imperceptibly. The camera, which has spent so long looking backward, now turns forward. Cities glow at night like constellations on the surface of the Earth. Satellites drift overhead. Data flows invisibly across continents in pulses of light. The modern world feels permanent, layered with steel, glass, and digital memory. Yet permanence is an illusion we have inherited before. One day, modern humanity will stand where ancient lineages once stood, unaware that time is already thinning its record. Environmental change reshapes coastlines again. Ice melts. Storms intensify. Regions dry or flood unpredictably. The planet continues its quiet recalibration. Our architecture feels durable, but much of it depends on maintenance. Without constant care, cities decay quickly, steel corrodes, concrete fractures, glass shatters and dissolves. Digital archives, which hold more collective memory than any stone library, require energy and infrastructure to remain accessible. Remove electricity, and vast portions of modern knowledge become unreadable in a single generation. When the distant future looks back at us, what will remain and what will vanish? The question is no longer hypothetical. It is cyclical. Future researchers, if they exist, may sift through fragmented remnants of our era the same way we study scattered bones and broken tools. They may uncover foundations where skyscrapers once stood, their purposes inferred from patterns rather than preserved plans. They might discover digital storage devices without the means to decode them. Our most intricate records could dissolve into unreadable artifacts. Survival bias will shape interpretation. Then, just as it shapes ours now. Coastal megacities may lie submerged if sea levels continue to rise. Inland settlements may endure longer. Regions spared by climate extremes may preserve more structure. As with the past, what survives will influence what is believed. Environmental shifts and technological transformation are altering evolution in real time. Global interconnectedness changes patterns of gene flow. Medical intervention reshapes selective pressures. Cultural transmission accelerates at unprecedented speed. Yet, none of this guarantees continuity. It only alters the conditions under which continuity unfolds. Forgotten ancestors once stood where we stand, now convinced of their presence and relevance. They built, traded, told stories, and made decisions without awareness that centuries would reduce them to fragments. Their everyday lives, meaningful and urgent to them, became archaeological inference to us. So too will ours. This reflection does not diminish human achievement. It places it within a broader continuum. Emergence and disappearance are not exceptions in history. They are rhythm, growth and contraction, preservation and erosion. The unsettling realization settles quietly, just as we speculate about lost lineages and cultural resets. Future generations may reconstruct us imperfectly. They may debate our timelines. They may misunderstand our intentions. They may see only pieces, shaped by survival bias. Humanity stands suspended between what has been forgotten and what will one day be forgotten. The camera pulls back from illuminated cities to the curvature of Earth. The planet rotates steadily, indifferent to epochs, with past and future now mirrored. A final question begins to crystallize. Is humanity's story defined more by what survives, or by what is forever lost? The room is quiet. A projector hums softly as a familiar image glows against a white screen. A sequence of figures moves from left to right, stooped, then straighter, then fully upright. Students take notes. The diagram feels settled, almost timeless, as if it has always existed in this precise form. Simple stories endure because they soothe. Linear ascent is easy to understand. Clear winners and clean extinctions create closure. One lineage rises, others fall away. The narrative moves forward with reassuring direction. It fits neatly into a textbook chapter. It can be summarized in a paragraph, printed on a poster, remembered long after details fade. The camera drifts across museum exhibits, where glass cases display skull replicas arranged in tidy progressions. Labels offer concise descriptions. Dates appear precise. The complexity of debate is distilled into short captions. A visitor can walk through millennia in less than an hour. This is not deception. It is translation. Education favors coherence. Public memory favors clarity. When specialists debate nuances, overlapping timelines, genetic intermingling, revised classifications, those details are often too intricate for introductory presentation. Simplification becomes necessary to build foundational understanding. Over time, however, streamlined explanations solidify into certainty. How much of what we know about our ancestors is actually an echo of older explanations? The question does not accuse. it invites reflection. Scientific models evolve. Fossils are reinterpreted. Migration timelines shift with new dating methods. Yet, public imagination can lag behind revision. A diagram learned decades ago may still shape perception long after specialists have redrawn it quietly, in journals few outside the field. Read, some interpretations that once felt stable remain embedded in collective memory, even after refinement. The image of a singular march of progress. The belief in one definitive migration wave. The assumption that certain cognitive traits appeared suddenly and exclusively. These ideas were useful scaffolding, but scaffolding is meant to be adjusted as construction continues. The gap between research and reception grows subtly. Specialists move cautiously, refining models as new data emerges. Public understanding, built upon older simplifications, often remains unchanged until dramatic shifts force reconsideration. Forgotten ancestors are not lost only in time. They are sometimes lost in translation. The lecture hall remains calm. The diagram still glows. It is not entirely wrong. It is incomplete. There is comfort in straight lines. They suggest inevitability. They imply that humanity's rise followed a predictable path. But the deeper record, as we have seen, resists such neatness. Overlapping populations complicate replacement narratives. Genetic evidence blurs boundaries. Submerged settlements challenge geographic centrality. The simple story persists because it serves a purpose. It makes the vastness of prehistory digestible. Yet once one becomes aware of its limits, the comfort softens. The viewer senses a quiet tension between clarity and accuracy, between pedagogy and precision. Not conspiracy, constraint. If public memory lags behind discovery, then the next layer of misunderstanding may not stem from ignorance alone. It may arise from imagination itself. Curiosity is a powerful force. It begins gently with a question about bones or migration routes, and then it stretches further. When evidence thins and silence expands, imagination steps in. It fills gaps with narrative, sometimes cautiously, sometimes boldly. Human origins have always invited speculation. When ancient ruins stand without clear explanation, stories arise. When fossils seem unusual or incomplete, interpretations multiply. Popular culture has often dramatized this uncertainty, suggesting hidden advanced ancestors, lost prehistoric empires, or technologies erased by catastrophe. These ideas linger because they feel satisfying. They offer closure to mystery. They transform absence into dramatic concealment, rather than quiet loss. But there is a difference between possibility and projection. What if the real mystery of human origins is more profound than any legend? The question reframes the tension. It does not dismiss imagination. It refines it. Speculation begins as a natural extension of inquiry. We ask what might have existed beyond the visible record. We imagine cultures submerged beneath oceans or innovations forgotten in sand. These possibilities can inspire exploration. Yet when narrative outruns evidence, wonder can turn into distortion. The goal is not to extinguish curiosity. It is to protect it. The authentic story of forgotten human ancestors does not require mythical super-civilizations or forbidden technologies. The record we already possess reveals repeated bottlenecks that nearly ended our lineage. It shows diverse populations interacting and merging in ways more complex than any single diagram suggests. It points to erased settlements beneath rising seas and cultural resets that thinned knowledge across generations. These realities are extraordinary without embellishment. It is tempting to assume that if complexity appeared in fragments, it must once have been grand beyond measure. But human history demonstrates that innovation can arise incrementally through cooperation and adaptation rather than sudden leaps into advanced sophistication. The remarkable lies in resilience, not spectacle. Holding curiosity and skepticism together requires balance. One without the other creates imbalance. Excessive doubt narrows imagination. Unchecked speculation detaches from grounding. In the quiet hours when questions about deep time feel expansive, it is easy to drift toward dramatic explanation. The mind prefers coherence. It seeks patterns that resolve uncertainty neatly. Yet, the more patient approach acknowledges that mystery often remains layered and incomplete. There is humility in restraint. To recognize that ancient civilizations rose and fell without invoking hidden technologies is not to diminish them. It is to respect their complexity. To accept that genetic evidence suggests convergence and divergence, without assuming lost global empires, is to remain faithful to available data. The deeper mystery may lie in how ordinary processes, climate fluctuation, migration, cooperation, adaptation, generated extraordinary outcomes. The survival of one lineage among many, the preservation of fragments through geological chaos, the layering of cultural memory across resets. These are profound without exaggeration. As the narrative slows again, speculation softens into reflection. With imagination balanced against evidence, attention turns inward, beyond diagrams, beyond debate, beyond speculation. There is a quieter layer, the emotional meaning of lost ancestors. The camera leaves the laboratory and the lecture hall behind. It returns to open land. Wind moves across wide plains that seem untouched, though they once carried footprints that are now gone. Grass bends where fires once burned. Rivers shift where camps once stood. Entire branches of humanity lived here. They formed bonds. They laughed around evening fires. They argued, mourned, celebrated births. Children learned the contours of their world through stories told in familiar voices. For them, existence felt immediate and meaningful. Their concerns were as urgent as ours are now. And then, over time, they disappeared. Not always in sudden catastrophe. Not always in violent confrontation. Sometimes their numbers thinned gradually. Climate tightened around them. Migration waves altered territories. Interbreeding diluted distinct identity until separate labels dissolved. A lineage did not end on a single day. It faded. Extinction is often imagined as dramatic. In reality, it can be quiet. A settlement shrinks. A hunting route is no longer travelled. An elder's knowledge is not fully transmitted. A final generation passes, unaware that they represent the narrowing edge of a once broader branch. If other versions of us once lived and loved, what does it mean that only one lineage survived? The question carries emotional weight more than scientific challenge. The answer is not about superiority. It is about contingency. Modern humans are not necessarily the most destined of all past lineages. We are the ones who remained. We inherited traits shaped by chance alignments of environment, timing, migration, and cooperation. Those who vanished were not less intelligent or less human. They were situated in different conditions at different moments. This realization shifts the story from triumph to humility. For centuries, narratives of human evolution framed survival as a testament to inevitable advancement. One group rose because it was better. Others disappeared because they were inferior. But the deeper record complicates that certainty. Survival does not always reward the best. It rewards the well-situated. Humanity's existence today may be the product of narrow corridors. Periods where only small populations endured harsh climates or social stress. Had those corridors closed slightly differently, a different lineage might be telling this story. The wind continues across the plain. It does not distinguish between the living and the vanished. To hold this awareness is not to diminish modern humanity. It is to recognize fragility woven into our origin. We stand here not because history guaranteed us, but because countless variables aligned. The weight of quiet extinction lingers. It invites reflection rather than fear. It asks us to reconsider progress, not as steady ascent, but as survival through uncertainty. It reminds us that those who vanished were not stepping stones. They were parallel lives complete in themselves. And in acknowledging them, our own presence becomes less certain and more precious, with humility settling in. The narrative gathers itself for a final turn. It no longer asks only what was lost, but what remembering changes in us now. Dawn arrives again, much like it did at the beginning of this journey. Light stretches across open land. Wind moves gently through grass that has witnessed more lives than memory can hold. The landscape feels familiar, yet it carries new weight now. We know what once stood here. Multiple human lineages walked under similar skies. They shaped tools, painted walls, buried their dead, endured cold seasons and scorching droughts. Some adapted to mountain ranges, others to river valleys, others to coasts that no longer exist. Diversity thrived, branches extended outward, Then the narrowing began, climate shifted, ice advanced, seas rose, volcanic ash dimmed sunlight. Genetic bottlenecks compressed populations until only scattered groups remained. Interbreeding blurred boundaries between lineages. Cooperation networks strengthened some communities while others dissolved. Modern humanity emerged not from a single decisive victory, but from layered intersections of circumstance. Geography shielded certain populations. Timing spared others. Migration routes opened and closed. Cultural cohesion offered subtle advantages under pressure. Evolution did not promise survival. It created variation. It allowed adaptation. It left room for possibility. If history could have unfolded differently at countless moments, why are we the ones who remained? The question rests in quiet air. There were countless branching points where outcomes could have shifted. A harsher winter, a failed harvest, a migration delayed, a group separated too long to recover. Any number of variables might have tipped the balance toward a different continuation. Forgotten ancestors were not stepping stones placed carefully on a path leading to us. They were parallel lives, complete and intricate. They loved, feared, innovated, and dreamed within their own frameworks. Their disappearance was not an instruction for our arrival. It was contingency. The thread that connects early hominins to modern humanity is narrow. It passes through periods when survival was uncertain, when genetic diversity shrank dramatically, when extinction stood close enough to sense. That thread endured because a few communities adapted in ways sufficient for continuation. Randomness and resilience intertwined. This realization reframes triumph. Humanity did not climb inevitably toward the present. It navigated uncertainty repeatedly. It endured through cooperation, through migration, through cultural flexibility. Yet chance never left the equations. The landscape brightens as the sun rises higher. From this vantage, the story no longer feels linear. It feels woven, intersections of biology and environment, memory and adaptation. We are here because certain groups survived, because cultural networks stabilized, because bottlenecks did not close entirely, because convergence and divergence shaped outcomes in ways no one could foresee. Survival is not a verdict of superiority. It is a testament to persistence within unpredictability. And that awareness introduces a quieter, more pressing thought. If we are survivors of chance, beneficiaries of narrow corridors through deep time, then what responsibility comes with knowing how fragile those corridors were? The pace slows again. The landscape is quiet, almost still. There are no towering monuments here, no carved inscriptions declaring lineage or conquest, no preserved names. Only earth, sky, and the faint traces left behind, fragments of stone tools, subtle genetic signals, layers of sediment that hint at lives once lived. How do we remember those who left no ruins? Many human ancestors left no cities, no temples, no written accounts of their hopes or fears. Their identities dissolved into time. Their stories passed through voices that eventually fell silent. What remains is partial, a shard of bone, a pattern of DNA, a trace of fire long extinguished. Yet absence does not equal insignificance. Can we honor ancestors we will never fully know? The question feels both intimate and expansive. To remember does not require complete reconstruction. It requires acknowledgement. It requires recognizing that the present stands upon layers of vanished diversity. Remembering without ruins means accepting limitation. It means admitting that the past cannot be restored in full resolution. We will never know the sound of their laughter, the texture of their myths, the private details of their daily rhythms. But we know they were here. We know they shaped the world we inherited. Their influence is indirect, yet undeniable. Through interbreeding, fragments of their biology persist within us. Through environmental pressures, they survived, or did not. Selective pathways were shaped. Through cultural experimentation that rippled across networks, ideas may have traveled further than identities. Even their disappearance altered trajectories, narrowing possibilities and refining those that endured. Absence exerts force. A lineage that vanishes leaves ecological and cultural space behind. Other groups adapt in response. Innovations, once peripheral, may become central. Patterns of migration shift. The shape of survival changes because something is no longer there. Legacy is not always visible. Sometimes it lies in influence rather than inscription. The meditative tone deepens. Memory becomes less about retrieving every detail and more about recognizing continuity. We are not isolated in time. We are extensions of converging paths, many of which dissolved before they could be recorded. To remember without ruins is to carry humility. It is to honor the fact that our existence is braided with lives we cannot fully imagine. It is to understand that knowledge has edges, and that those edges do not diminish meaning. In acknowledging what we cannot know, we avoid filling silence with spectacle. We resist turning absence into fantasy. Instead, we stand quietly before it. There is dignity in that stillness. The ancestors without monuments deserve remembrance, not through grand reconstruction, but through awareness. Through the recognition that their resilience, their adaptation, their struggles formed part of the continuum that leads here. The sky brightens slightly as the narrative draws breath for its final widening. With remembrance grounded in humility, one question remains, extending beyond bones and DNA, beyond ruins and absence. When the lens lifts beyond the past and into the open horizon, what story will humanity continue to write? The camera rises slowly, leaving the plains and ruins behind. Mountains unfold beneath drifting clouds. Forests stretch in deep green silence. Deserts glow in warm tones where ancient footsteps once passed. Oceans move in broad, patient rhythms, the same waters that swallowed forgotten shorelines long ago. From above, the earth appears calm. These landscapes shaped every chapter of the story we have followed. Ice once pressed down from the poles. Rivers carved migration paths. Grasslands fed wandering bands. Coastlines opened and closed like breathing lungs. The planet did not conspire. It shifted within that shifting. Humanity emerged. Diversity expanded, then narrowed. Bottlenecks compressed entire lineages into scattered groups. Adaptation responded. Reinvention followed contraction. Again and again, the pattern repeated. Growth, pressure, adjustment. Not in straight lines, but in cycles. Extinction and emergence are not anomalies in this rhythm. They are woven into it. From this height, modern cities appear as brief glimmers against geological vastness. Highways resemble delicate threads. Light flickers across continents at night, suggesting permanence, yet resting upon landscapes far older and far less fragile than the structures we build. The forgotten human ancestors are not separate figures, locked in museums or etched into diagrams. They are phases of the same unfolding current that moves through us now. Their experiments, their adaptations, their disappearances, all shaped the path that led to this moment. Humanity is not a final form. It is a temporary expression. What future ancestors are forming right now, unaware that they, too, may one day be forgotten? The question does not seek prophecy. It invites perspective. Somewhere, children are being born into environments already shifting under climate change. Genetic patterns continue to circulate through global migration. Cultural innovations spread instantly across continents. The evolutionary current has not stopped. It has only changed tempo. Our era feels unique because it is ours. Every lineage felt the same. From the vantage point of deep time, individuality softens. Continuity remains. The same cycles that shaped ancient survival continue quietly. Diversity expands. Pressure narrows. Adaptation responds. Memory preserves what it can and releases what it cannot. The documentary closes not with finality, but with awareness. There is no triumphant endpoint. No definitive answer, sealed in stone. Only the steady unfolding of life across landscapes that endure longer than any single branch. The horizon curves gently into darkness as the planet turns. The story of forgotten human ancestors does not conclude here. It deepens. It continues within those who remember, and within those who will one day be remembered imperfectly, through fragments shaped by survival and loss alike.